Good morning, everybody. So glad to be with you this morning on this beautiful Sunday. It is incredible outside. I hope that you've been able to get out this weekend because the sun is shining and it's going to get warm. And as much as possible, get out of the house, turn off the TV, take a walk, play with your kids, do something, get some exercise. We all need that right now. Anyway, it's great to be with you this morning. I'm so thankful. My name is Jason Wiggin. I'm one of the pastors here at Redwood Chapel, and I want to welcome you to Together. This is our opportunity on Sunday mornings, our small group that meets normally. If you're new to us, normally we meet at 9:30 in our church building. But since the COVID-19 pandemic has occurred, we now meet virtually. So if you're new, thank you so much for joining us. Hope you're blessed today by our teaching and our time together. All of the links that you need are downstairs in the description. That's the Zoom Hangout, that's the prayer sheet, that's the half sheet. It's all there. Go ahead and click onto those as we get started. If you have your Bibles, open them up to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to continue our series in the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus' radical view of what life could look like if we took him and we took the gospel seriously. The Sermon on the Mount is both idealistic and it's realistic. It's idealistic because it definitely offers a view of human flourishing that is reminiscent of the Garden of Eden, actually. In a world of perfection before the fall, before sin entered the world, Jesus gives us a vision of what the world could look like without sin in it. But it's also very realistic in that it's realistic about the realities of sin and the realities of temptation and the brokenness of our world, but it's also realistic in that it gives us a grasp, it gives the people of Jesus a grasp on what life, not only how it can look, but that it can be attained. And so that's why this series, I think, is so helpful right now, because we're in a place where a lot of us are rethinking our whole lives, our whole perspective on everything. And the gospel, especially Jesus' words here in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, give us an idealistic and a realistic look on how we might live our lives in this season. Well, last week we talked about anger. Last week we talked about anger and Jesus' view of anger. And what Jesus basically helps us to understand is that anger is a natural human emotion that can come from a righteous place, but if left unchecked, can become very destructive. And so if you want to go back and look at that teaching, you can in our other videos. This morning we're going to be continuing and looking at Jesus' view on sexuality and lust and marriage. And so I want to offer a warning right now. If you're watching this morning with your kids, or I guess it would just be your kids who may not be ready for the subject material, what we're going to be talking about is not explicit, but we are going to be talking about sexuality this morning. So if this is something that you want to pause for your kids and maybe send them out of the room, now would be a great time to do that. And anyway, I remember when I was in middle school and high school, I wrestled. And I loved being on the wrestling team. It was a great challenge. If you're wondering if was I a good wrestler or not, how well did I do, I'll put it to you this way. If you stepped out on the mat with me, you had a 50-50 chance of winning. So, I loved wrestling just because it was a lot of fun and it was a test of strength and a great way to stay in shape, especially as kind of a pudgy little junior hire that I was. Anyway, as I remember, as many of you may also, if you had this experience in middle school and high school, the conversations before and after practice with the other guys on the team normally were the kinds of conversations that were both inappropriate, were downright obscene, and it's just kind of the nature of boys' locker room. Not saying it's okay, just saying it's just kind of what happens a lot. And the discussions and the topics are normally in a crude vein. And I remember one day, it was after practice, and we were getting ready to leave. We're kind of just having a break and drinking some water and about to leave, and the discussion started to center around girls, which they all often did. But the conversation was about girls that you liked, girls that you thought were cute, and girls that you wanted to maybe take things to an inappropriate place in a sexual nature. And I remember sitting in that place, sitting in those conversations, and just hoping that I could just be a listener, because as the good church boy that I thought I was, I knew that deep down inside, these were not the kind of conversations that I should take part in verbally, actually giving my opinion or saying different words. But I didn't mind listening. And inevitably, I remember there was one day after practice where the conversation came to me. Jason, if you could have any girl, who would it be? And I remember sitting there thinking, I know what the right answer is. It's I need to leave. But being 15 years old in this environment full of hormones and and just completely blindsided, not blindsided, but just feeling trapped, like I had to give an answer, like my entire reputation was on the line here. What I thought was the right answer was, oh, I don't do that, I'm a Christian. And I knew that wasn't going to impress the guys. And so I remember I just made up I didn't make up, but I threw a name out there. And the sad thing was, it was a friend of mine. And it was someone that at the time I thought was attractive and I thought was cute, but it was a friend of mine. And immediately in that moment, I remember thinking clearly, I have just turned this friend of mine into a non-human. Maybe those are not the exact words that went through my head, but I just turned this girl into a non-human. I completely objectified her. She is not a human being with the image of God. She is now just a thing for my pleasure or my thought life. And as we look into the scriptures this morning, and as we think about this idea of, or as we consider Jesus' view on sexuality and lust, I think what we're going to find is that many of us may realize that we have maybe an improper view of what the scriptures teach about sexuality, or maybe maybe we don't want to grasp on what what the scriptures teach about sexuality. Last week, what we said was that Christians have had a tricky record with anger, and I would say the same thing is true with sexuality. If you look into the history of the Jewish people before Jesus, you actually find that the Jews had a very good and deep understanding of sexuality, seeing it as a gift. It's something from God, it's something to be enjoyed. Does that mean that they had all of their ways sorted out correctly? No, of course not. But they did not have a low view of sexuality. You go into the church time post-Jesus, when the church is established, and the church establishes not only a high view of sexuality as a gift from God, but it also gives a view of men and women that is equal before God, that there isn't a hierarchy between the genders. And then something happened in the 3rd century. The church father by the name of Origen, whom was highly influential, very much respected, and gave us a lot of great things in the church. However, his view of sexuality was not one as it being a great gift, but that at best, it was a necessary evil. In fact, Origen's view of sexuality was so low that he actually castrated himself, yikes, because he didn't want to fall into any kind of sexual sin or temptation. What that did is it began a almost 2,000 year journey that the church went on, that really were only, or view of sexuality that we're really only beginning to heal from right now. In the Middle Ages, church, not all, but many church historians and many commentators and biblical scholars took the Song of Solomon to be not an erotic love poem and celebrating marriage and sexuality, but really it was more and completely an allegory of Christ and the church, which is certainly there, but not the main thrust of the story. In the early 20th century, the holiness movement caused there was such a degree of protection over men and their wandering eyes and their lustful minds that they would actually make tablecloths that went all the way down to the floor because they believed they didn't want men to see the curvature of certain table legs because it might sexually arouse them. That's a true statement. In the 80s and 90s of the 20th century, there was a church movement called True Love Waits, and it was a response to the free love movement of the 60s and 70s, and it was a movement. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, but it was a movement in which teenagers would take pledges with their parents and would wear purity rings to symbolize their chastity and to keep their sexual urges at bay. I'm not dissing it. I'm just saying that was just kind of a weird thing that we did. And then in the culture wars of the early 2000s, the battle that Christians have taken, or the battlefront that Christians have taken, is that we want people to know what we are against rather than what we are for. And the results of all of this, and I'm way overgeneralizing and I'm skipping a lot of things obviously, but the results of all of this have been quite devastating. Many Christians continue to have a less than positive view of their sexuality, which makes it a master over their lives. It makes it impossible for them to talk about with their kids, and it has a negative impact on their marriages, on their singleness, on their view of other people. Then the other thing is that there's a growing number of people who claim to be Christians, who report having views or say they have views that are different than the historical view of the church, and are actually leaving the church. In fact, there's studies that are saying that more and more people, Christianity Today found this, that more and more people are leaving the church, not because of any views about Jesus or miracles or the resurrection or any kind of deep-rooted theology, but simply over the historic view of sexuality clashing with our modern view. Now, in my opinion, these results are the case, have become the case for two reasons. There are two reasons why people are leaving the church over the view of sexuality, why people are why Christians have such a low view of their sexuality, or why Christians are having an opposite view of the historic view of sexuality of the church. And the first reason is this: a bad or non-interpretation of the Bible when it comes to what it teaches about sexuality. Secondly, a reluctance of accepting the Bible's teaching on sexuality for fear of being outcasted by our culture. Now this morning what I'd like to do is briefly address both of these issues, and not so much go into the Christian view of sexuality. We've done that a ton in our class, and we can just say that God loves sex. It was his idea. He invented it. But what we're going to do is answer those two, or talk about those two reasons why there's such pushback, why people have a bad or non-interpretation of the Bible when it comes to what it teaches about sexuality, and then secondly, why is there reluctance, or why is there such a reluctance of accepting the Bible's teaching, and which leads to a fear of being outcasted by our culture. Let's read this passage together. And again, we're not going to look at everything in here, just want to look at a couple of things. Jesus says in verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than all of your whole body to be thrown in hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell." Verse 31, "It was also said, 'Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce.' But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." Now, Jesus, right off the bat, does the same thing in this passage as he did last week when he talked about anger. He's combating a teaching from the Pharisees, which was a minimalistic philosophy on sin and obedience. So last week it was, hey, just don't kill anyone, and you're not breaking commandment 6, thou shalt not murder. Just don't kill anyone. And again, he's coming out and saying, look, just don't have sex with anyone who's not your spouse, and you're not committing adultery. right? That was the teaching of the Pharisees. And Jesus is saying, if that's your view, if that is the position that you're going to take, that you take a bare minimum approach, then you're missing the heart of God. Now, I want to say something very clear here. Jesus is not saying that it is wrong to find someone attractive. He's not saying that it is wrong for you to find someone who's not your spouse attractive, okay? Attractiveness is very subjective. It is, everybody has their own views on what is attractive and what's not, what's sexually attractive, right? We all have those, and just walking around, you see someone, you see a man or a woman, you say that person is attractive, and you just kind of register that in your brain. Jesus is not saying that that is wrong. He is also not saying that it is wrong for that attractiveness to then go into your brain, and your brain then fires off all of these biological chemicals in you that give you an urge to say, I wonder what it would like to be sexual with that person. Jesus is not saying that all of a sudden that it is wrong for you to say that person is attractive and I find them sexually appealing. He's not saying that that's a sin. That would be impossible to get rid of. Those are natural functions that God put into our body. What he is saying when he talks about lust is when we look at a man or a woman and we say, that person's attractive, I want that, I have to have that. And we take the second look, and the third look, and the fourth look, and the fifth look, and we begin to reorganize and reorient our entire life to have that woman, whether in reality or in our minds. We begin to mentally undress. We begin to fantasize about what it would be like to be with that person. Jesus' point here is that is when we've entered into a mental adultery. That is when we have crossed the line. Please understand, it is not a sin to find someone attractive. You can't stop yourself from doing that. What is wrong is when you begin to say, if I have to have that person, whether in reality or whether in my mind. Now, the opposite of that is it's wrong to be attractive and it's wrong to have any kind of sexual urges. And I remember that was I felt like that was the teaching that I received growing up. In my experience, I've heard more of the negative side of this teaching than the positive. And what I've always heard about sexuality is this. Look, don't commit adultery, don't lust, don't get divorced, and if you have to, cut off your hands and gouge out your eye. But again, that doesn't get to the heart of God. God is not merely concerned with us following the rules. He wants us to know his heart and his kingdom so that we can live. Listen to this. He wants us to live in the fullest, most complete life possible on this side of eternity. So let's go back to those issues that we raised just a moment ago. Issue number one. One reason why people are rejecting the Bible's teaching about sexuality is because of a bad or non-interpretation of the scriptures. And that is easy to do if you only look at one verse or one passage of the time. As disciples of Jesus, our job or our responsibility is to not just take one verse and build an entire theology on it. It is to take the entire counsel of Scripture, all of biblical theology regarding different topics, and come to a conclusion that way. Just looking at one passage might give us a very negative impression of the Bible's teaching about sexuality. But Jesus, as a rabbi, knew the Old Testament well and knew what it taught about marriage and sexuality. He knew the story of Adam and Eve being joined together in Genesis 2. He knew the love story of Ruth and Boaz, who, by the way, were his direct ancestors, and how God brought those two together in this beautiful marriage. He knew the erotic love poem of Song of Solomon. Simply put, Jesus had the highest value and opinion of marriage and sexuality because, as God, they were his idea. He created them. They were his idea for us to enjoy. So when he says, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart, it came from a place not of telling us, no, 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 but a place of seeing sexuality as a gift to mankind. The bad or non-interpretation of what the scriptures say about sexuality it leads us to being grossed out by it and ashamed of it, or seeing it only as a necessary evil. Now, again, in my experience, I've seen in a lot of evangelical churches, and again, I think we're coming out of this, which is a good thing, that sexuality is just kind of this thing we don't talk about. It is, at best it's a necessary evil, and yet that's not the view that God has about it. A right interpretation of the scriptures in regards to our sexuality sees that sex is not gross, but it is a gift. Now, I recognize that this may be difficult for some of us because we've either had bad understandings of our sexuality, or sex has been used as a weapon against us. Now, talk about these things is another teaching for another day. I'll just say this, that any one of us who has experienced sex as being used as a weapon against us, that there is healing and restoration that can come through Jesus Christ. It is there, it can be found. And I'd love to talk about that another time, but let's continue. I'll just say this and then we'll move on. Jesus' command against lust was not just about you and your thought life. It was also to help you and to keep you from objectifying other people and thus taking away their humanity. When we lust after other people, we take away their humanity. We take away them being created in the image of God. You've probably heard it said, they just become a hunk of meat. And that is not what Jesus intended when he created human beings. Men, women, all people are created in God's image. And when he says do not lust after someone, that's a reminder that that person that you're looking at and that you find attractive has been made in the image of God, has an eternal soul with incalculable value that God has put on them. The second thing is that Jesus' command against lust and divorce is not because Jesus hates you for having sexual thoughts or wanting to fulfill your sexual desires. His command comes from him wanting you to enjoy and experience your sexuality in the way that he intended, which is between a husband and a wife. Not only God, but all of the social studies, every single study on sexuality says that a husband and wife have the best sex. So anyway, take that for what you want. Issue number 2. There's a reluctance of accepting the Bible's teaching on sexuality for the simple fear of being outcasted by the culture. I remember as a youth pastor, I would have conversations with students, and they would come to me and they'd say, I'm thinking about leaving the church. I'm thinking about not being a Christian anymore. And my mind would go crazy, and I would just freak out and say, well, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Do you not believe in the resurrection? Do you not believe what the Bible teaches about life and creation? And what their answers usually were is, yes, those I can grasp and understand. But I have friends who live outside of the historic teachings of the church on sexuality. And because the Bible teaches against that, I just don't think that I can be a Christian. Now, there's a lot that we can say about this, but I would prefer to be brief for this morning. It should come as no surprise that the Bible's teaching on sexuality and the historic position that the church has taken on sexuality run contrary to our culture. That should not come as a surprise. And where we used to agree to disagree on what the best view of sexuality for human flourishing is, it's now a war zone with potential casualties and friendly fire. And without going into too much detail, I'll just say this. It's hard to argue that there isn't a scriptural, historical view of sexuality that hasn't been a part of the church for the last 2,000 years. Yet for some followers of Jesus, rather than face the social consequences of keeping to the view of Scripture's teaching, or at a minimum, wrestle with it and try to figure out why God would teach and command certain things. Some have adopted the world's view of sexuality and have left the church altogether. In doing so, they reveal that for them, sexuality is not gross, it's not gift, it's a God. It's a God to be worshipped. It's a God to be bowed down to. And their view of sexuality has come in higher than their view of Jesus. When we look at sex as a God, that elevates our sexuality or others' sexuality above Jesus. It has become an idol. When we make it into something gross, into something that's just a mere physical act that's either just kind of along the lines of our hookup culture, or it's something gross that we don't want to talk about. There is deep spiritual and emotional pain that comes from that. Both of those are rooted in a fear of man. I fear what other people will think of me because I hold to a view that's contrary to the masses. I fear the opinions of others more than I fear the opinion of God. And look, I realize and I recognize that there's a lot of nuance to this kind of teaching, and so much more can and probably should be said to that. I'll recap and I'll kind of close with saying these three things, with these three takeaways. Number one, a bad or a non-interpretation of the scriptures leads to false ideas about God, life, and religious devotion. I mean, put sexuality to aside for a moment. A bad or non-interpretation of the scriptures leads us to some very wacky, wonky, crazy ideas about the way life is supposed to be, and who God is and his love for us. And if we don't interpret the scriptures, if we don't even read the scriptures, we get into the idea or the thought that God may not even care about us. Takeaway number two, Jesus's words on adultery, lust, and divorce came from having a high and holy view of sexuality, that it is a good gift from God. As disciples of Jesus, we believe wholeheartedly that God gave sexuality as a gift, and Jesus gives these harsh words and these heavy commands against lust and divorce and whatnot, because sex and marriage was such a beautiful thing in his mind, had such a high place, a high holy view in his mind. That's why there's such a harsh protection around it. Takeaway number three, and this is just a good reminder for us. The disciple of Jesus chooses to live outside of cultural norms and opinions because he or she sees with ever-growing clarity, and that's an important word, I'll talk about it in a second, but with ever-growing clarity that God's view of human flourishing is better than everything else. I'll say it again, the disciple of Jesus chooses to live outside of cultural norms and opinions because he or she sees with ever-growing clarity that God's view of human flourishing is better than anything else. I say ever-growing clarity because none of us have arrived at any kind of place of perfection. We're all growing and we're all wrestling and trying to understand better and better how we are to live in this world. And it starts with picking up our Bible and reading and seeing what God has to say, not just about sexuality, but about how we raise our kids, how we spend our money, how we take our free time. Do we have free time? Everything the scriptures teach of it. Now, obviously, there's more that we could say about this topic. We've said much about it in the past in our class. Here's my prayer for you. My prayer for you this week is that as we continue to look at Jesus' view of the good life, and as we've talked about human flourishing from God's perspective, that you would at least consider how your view of sexuality might be different than God's and why that might be the case. We all come from different places. Some of us grew up in the church. Some of us didn't grow up in the church. Some of us grew up in a very safe environment. Others of us, sex has been used as a weapon against us. And so all of us are coming at this from a different place. The good thing is that no matter where we come from in our growing up, the Bible speaks to every single place. The Bible speaks to every path. And so it's why it's so important that we need to hold on to the scriptures. In addition, my prayer for us is that as we continue to grow in the knowledge of God and the power of Jesus, that the Holy Spirit would give us wisdom on how to walk every single day. I love you guys. I miss you so much. I can't wait to hug you. I can't wait to be with you again. For now, we'll enjoy our Zoom session. Again, the link is downstairs, so go ahead and check that out. I love you all. Again, if there's something that I can do for you, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to try to make it happen. Take care. Adios.